Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Shadow Creek, West Virginia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The autumn of 1904 cast long shadows over the small mining town of Shadow Creek, nestled in the dense forests of southern West Virginia. The town itself was unremarkable, a collection of wooden structures huddled around the entrance to the Blue Ridge Coal Company mine that had given birth to the settlement some 30 years prior. What made Shadow Creek remarkable, however, was not its architecture or its economic significance, but rather the events that unfolded within the walls of the Pettry family home on October 17, 1904. A date that would be remembered by locals for generations as the day every door stayed closed. According to county records, the Pettry residence stood on the eastern edge of town, approximately half a mile from the mine entrance, on what is now known as Maple Ridge Road. The house was a two-story structure with a small front porch, 4 bedrooms upstairs, and a root cellar that extended beneath the kitchen. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not just what allegedly occurred inside that house, but the fact that nearly every detail of the incident was systematically erased from official records in the years that followed. The Pettry family consisted of Samuel Pettry, age 43, a foreman at the Blue Ridge mine, his wife Martha, age 39, and Samuel's brother Edward, age 41, who had moved in with the family after sustaining a back injury that left him unable to work in the mines. A thorough examination of local church records indicates that Martha had lost 3 pregnancies in the 4 years prior to 1904, information that was curiously omitted from her obituary when it was published in the Shadow Creek Herald the following year. The events of October 17th might have been completely forgotten were it not for the Journal of Dr. Thomas Harrington, the town's only physician, which was discovered during a renovation of the Shadow Creek Medical Clinic in 1962. Dr. Harrington's journal, with its precise clinical observations, provides the most comprehensive account of what transpired in the final months of the Pettry family's residence in Shadow Creek. Shadow Creek itself was established in 1872, when the Blue Ridge Coal Company first broke ground on what would become one of the most productive mining operations in southern West Virginia. The company built housing for its workers, a company store, and eventually a small school. By 1904, the town had grown to approximately 600 residents, nearly all of whom depended on the mine for their livelihood. The Pettry brothers had moved to Shadow Creek in 1889, part of a wave of workers attracted by the promise of steady employment. Samuel quickly distinguished himself as a reliable worker with a mind for the technical aspects of mining. Within 5 years, he had been promoted to shift supervisor and then to foreman by 1898. His personnel file, preserved in the Blue Ridge Company archives and examined by researchers in 1964, described him as exceptionally steady, sober, and devoted to the company's interests. This portrait of Samuel as a pillar of stability makes the events of 1904 all the more perplexing. Edward, by contrast, was described by co-workers as more reserved than his brother, according to statements gathered by Dr. Harrington in September 1904. Edward had been a competent miner, but lacked his brother's ambition. Edward was content to work his shift and then return home, noted fellow miner James Connolly in a statement preserved in Harrington's journal. Not one for the saloon or social gatherings, that one. Kept to himself, but pleasant enough when spoken to. Changed a bit after his accident, though. Got even quieter. Seemed distracted-like. The accident that would ultimately change the course of the Pettry family occurred on April 12, 1904. Company records indicate that Edward was working in the eastern section of the mine, an area known to the miners as the Deep Cut, due to its location far beneath the mountain, when a partial collapse trapped him for nearly 6 hours. When rescue workers finally reached him, Edward was found conscious but disoriented, sitting calmly amid the rubble as if waiting patiently to be discovered. The company doctor, Dr. Harrington, examined Edward and found him to have sustained a significant injury to his lower back, as well as numerous lacerations and contusions. Most concerning to Harrington, however, was Edward's peculiar affect following the accident. In his journal entry dated April 13, 1904, he wrote, "Patient E. Pettry presents with an unusual calmness, given the severity of his injuries and the traumatic nature of his experience. When questioned about the collapse and the hours spent trapped, he responds with vague statements that it was peaceful down there, and that the darkness spoke to him. I have prescribed bed rest and laudanum for pain, though he seems surprisingly indifferent to his physical discomfort." In the weeks following the accident, Edward moved into his brother's home to recuperate. According to statements later given by neighbors, Samuel and Martha were initially attentive caretakers, with Martha frequently seen picking medicinal herbs from her garden to prepare poultices for Edward's wounds. The arrangement seemed beneficial for all parties. Samuel and Martha had the help they needed after Martha's most recent miscarriage, and Edward had family to care for him during his recovery. The first indications that something might be amiss in the Pettry household came in early June 1904. Church attendance records from the Shadow Creek Methodist Church indicate that Martha, previously a regular at Sunday services, began to attend sporadically. By July, she had stopped coming altogether. When visited by the pastor's wife, Harriet Wilson, Martha allegedly explained her absence by citing the need to care for Edward, whose condition she described as complex and requiring constant attention. Mrs. Wilson's account of this visit, recorded in a letter to her sister that was later donated to the County Historical Society, provides the first external glimpse into the changing atmosphere of the Pettry home. I called upon Martha Pettry yesterday, having missed her familiar face at services these past weeks. The house, once so welcoming, struck me immediately as altered in some indefinable way. The curtains were drawn despite the beautiful summer day, and a peculiar odor, something like damp earth and chemical preservatives, seemed to permeate the parlor. Martha herself appeared tired beyond measure, with a nervousness to her movements that I had not observed before. When I inquired after Edward, she glanced quickly toward the ceiling and lowered her voice to say he was resting upstairs and could not be disturbed. What troubled me most, however, was her insistence that I leave before sundown, as Edward becomes active in the evening hours, and it's best not to have visitors then. When I suggested that perhaps Edward might benefit from the company of a friendly face, Martha became quite agitated, saying, "He's not himself after dark. None of us are any more." Dr. Harrington first noted a visit to the Pettry home in late August 1904, nearly 2 months before the incident. His entry reads, "Called to the Pettry residence regarding Martha's recurring headaches and episodes of disorientation. Samuel reports she has been experiencing difficulty sleeping and often complains of voices in the walls, prescribed laudanum for the pain, and suggested more time outdoors. The house has a peculiar atmosphere, stuffy and unnaturally quiet." Edward was absent during my visit, though I could hear movement from the upstairs bedroom. A subsequent entry dated September 3rd adds, "Samuel Pettry came to my office today, requesting additional laudanum for Martha. When questioned about her condition, he appeared evasive, claiming the medication was helping, but that her sleep was still disturbed by noises in the night." When I inquired directly about Edward's recovery, Samuel's demeanor changed markedly. He stated that his brother's back pain had subsided, but that Edward had developed unusual habits that were disturbing Martha's rest. Upon pressing for details, Samuel reluctantly admitted that Edward had taken to nocturnal wanderings through the house, often standing motionless in doorways or at the foot of their bed for hours at a time. Most concerning was Samuel's description of finding Edward in the root cellar at dawn on several occasions, surrounded by jars containing what Samuel described as collections. When asked to elaborate on the nature of these collections, Samuel became visibly uncomfortable, saying only that Edward had developed an interest in the natural world since his accident. Before leaving, Samuel requested information about the possibility of having Edward examined at the Greenbrier Asylum, though he was quick to add that he wasn't ready to take that step just yet. I provided him with the necessary forms, but cautioned that Edward's behavior, while unusual, might simply be a psychological response to his traumatic experience in the mine. Samuel's parting words have stayed with me. "Doctor, have you ever looked at someone you've known your whole life and suddenly felt you were looking at a stranger?" The doctor's observations continued through September, documenting Martha's deteriorating condition. "Martha Pettry's symptoms have worsened," he wrote on September 11th. "She now refuses to enter certain rooms of the house, particularly the kitchen after sundown. Samuel appears increasingly agitated by his wife's behavior." When questioned about Edward, Samuel stated his brother had taken to spending most days in his room due to increased pain from his injury. I noted Samuel's hands were raw and blistered, unusual for a mine foreman whose duties rarely include manual labor. A particularly revealing piece of evidence emerged in 1964 when a former employee of the company store, Howard Jenkins, provided researchers with a ledger he had kept privately. The ledger documented unusual purchasing patterns by the Pettry family in the months leading up to October 1904. Beginning in July, Samuel began making weekly purchases of items that seemed peculiar for a household of 3 adults. Excessive quantities of salt, 20-30 pounds at a time, unusual amounts of lye soap, multiple locks and chains, and on 3 separate occasions, large rolls of heavy canvas tarpaulin. Most notable was an entry from early October, just weeks before the incident, in which Samuel purchased 6 new padlocks, 20 pounds of nails, several hammers, and what Jenkins described in his notes as enough laudanum to put a horse to sleep. When Jenkins inquired about the unusual purchase, Samuel reportedly explained that he was securing the house against the coming winter, and that the laudanum was for both Martha's headaches and Edward's back pain, which he claimed had worsened with the changing season. What emerges from Harrington's journal is a portrait of a household in quiet decline. Neighbors later reported to the doctor that the Pettry home, once a hub of social gatherings for the mine workers and their families, had become increasingly isolated. The curtains remained drawn at all hours, and Martha, who had previously been active in the local church, stopped attending services entirely by mid-September. An account from George Miller, a fellow miner who occasionally shared a meal with the Pettrys before the household's isolation, provides insight into Edward's changing behavior. In a statement given to Sheriff Collins in late October and preserved in the county archives, Miller recalled, "Last time I saw Edward was early September. Samuel had invited me for Sunday dinner, something he hadn't done in months. Edward looked thin, sickly-like, but it was his manner that struck me most. Throughout the meal, he barely touched his food, just pushed it around his plate. But the whole time, his eyes never left me, staring with this intensity that made my skin crawl." At one point, when Martha went to the kitchen, Edward leaned across the table and asked me the strangest question. He said, "George, have you ever felt the mountain breathing when you're deep in the tunnels?" Before I could answer, he continued, "It's alive down there, you know. Not like us, but alive all the same. And it's lonely." Samuel came back into the room then, and Edward went silent. But later, as I was leaving, Edward gripped my arm, stronger than a man in his condition should have been able to, and whispered, "It wants to come up, George. It's found a way out." I didn't think much of it at the time, figured the accident had affected his mind, or maybe it was the laudanum talking, but now, after what happened, I can't help but wonder what he meant. The most telling entry in Harrington's journal comes from October 10th, just a week before the incident. Summoned to the Pettry home past midnight. Martha, in a state of extreme distress, found her sitting on the front porch despite the cold, refusing to re-enter the house. Samuel explained she had awakened screaming about something moving between the walls. Upon examination, Martha was feverish and disoriented, her wrists showing signs of restraint, rope marks which Samuel attributed to her having tied herself to the bedpost to prevent sleepwalking. Most concerning was Martha's whispered assertion that Edward was no longer Edward. When I requested to examine Edward, Samuel became defensive, stating his brother was finally sleeping soundly and should not be disturbed. I left additional laudanum and suggested Martha may benefit from time at the Greenbrier Asylum. If her condition persisted, the home smelled strongly of lye and coal dust. A supplementary note added to this entry, apparently written later the same day, reads, "Returned to my office to find Samuel waiting for me. His agitated state had given way to a kind of resigned calm. He asked very specific questions about the effects of long-term laudanum use and whether it might cause hallucinations or delusions. When I assured him that Martha's symptoms seemed beyond the scope of mere laudanum effects, he nodded as if I had confirmed something he already suspected. He then asked, in a manner that struck me as oddly detached, whether I believed in the concept of human consciousness being somehow separate from the physical body, whether a person could still appear physically unchanged while being fundamentally altered in some essential way. Before I could properly respond to this philosophical tangent, he stated, "Edward speaks to Martha when I'm at the mine, not as a brother should speak to his sister-in-law, but as something else, something that's wearing Edward like an ill-fitting suit." When I suggested that perhaps both he and Martha were suffering from a shared delusion brought on by stress and exhaustion, Samuel smiled in a way that raised the hair on the back of my neck. "We thought that too at first," he said. "We wanted to believe we were imagining it all. But there are things in the root cellar now that prove we aren't crazy. Things Edward has been collecting since the day they pulled him from the deep cut." The events of October 17th itself must be pieced together from multiple sources, as Dr. Harrington was not called to the home until the following day. According to statements given by neighboring miners to the Shadow Creek Herald, the day began unremarkably. Samuel Pettry reported to work at his usual time of 6:30 a.m., oversaw the morning shift change, and then unexpectedly requested permission to return home around noon, citing a household emergency. This was noted as unusual by Mine Superintendent William Blackburn, as Samuel was known for his perfect attendance and dedication to his position. In his later testimony to Sheriff Collins, Blackburn recalled, "Samuel seemed unlike himself that morning. Usually meticulous in his record-keeping and instructions to the men, he was distracted, kept checking his pocket watch every few minutes. When he asked to leave early, I naturally inquired about the nature of the emergency. His response was vague, something about Martha being unwell, but it was the look in his eyes that concerned me. There was a kind of desperate determination there, like a man who had come to some terrible decision and was now resolved to carry it through." What happened during the afternoon hours remains largely unsubstantiated. The only contemporary account comes from Eliza Jenkins, who lived in the nearest neighboring house, approximately 150 yards from the Pettry residence. In a statement later given to Dr. Harrington and preserved in his journal, Mrs. Jenkins reported hearing a terrible commotion from the direction of the Pettry home around 3 p.m., like furniture being dragged and someone hammering urgently. Mrs. Jenkins considered investigating, but decided against it, as she had previously been rebuffed by Samuel when expressing concern about Martha's well-being. There was shouting, too, Mrs. Jenkins added in her statement, though I couldn't make out the words clearly. It wasn't just Samuel's voice, but Martha's, too, which surprised me as she'd grown so quiet in recent months. And there was a third voice I didn't recognize, deeper, with a strange cadence to it. Not like normal speaking, but more like chanting or reciting something. The hammering continued for at least an hour, then everything went quiet all at once, as if someone had closed a heavy door between me and the sound. By 6 p.m., miners returning from the afternoon shift reported seeing smoke coming from the chimney of the Pettry house, unusual for an unseasonably warm October evening. More notably, they observed that every window of the house had been covered not just with curtains, but with what appeared to be blankets or heavy fabric. and a lantern burned on the front porch despite the daylight still lingering. According to the Shadow Creek Herald's subsequent reporting, it was around 9 p.m. when the first true indication that something was wrong emerged. Jacob Moore, a night shift worker walking to the mine, reported passing the Pettry house and hearing what he described as a sound like someone dragging something heavy downstairs. More disturbing was his observation that every door to the house, front, back, and the root cellar entrance, was secured with new padlocks on the outside. Moore, apparently unsettled by this unusual sight, quickened his pace and continued to work without investigating further. In his subsequent statement to authorities, Moore elaborated, "As I passed by, I called out to the house thinking Samuel might be on the porch, though I couldn't see clearly in the darkness. There was no answer, but the dragging sound stopped immediately. Then I heard what sounded like someone breathing very heavily just on the other side of the front door. I called out again, asking if everything was all right, and that's when I noticed all the locks. Brand new they were, gleaming even in the dim light. I remember thinking it strange to lock doors from the outside, seemed backward somehow. I was about to try the door when I heard a voice from inside. Not Samuel's or Martha's, but lower, rougher somehow. It said just one thing: the doors stay closed today. Something in that voice made me hurry away. Didn't feel right to me, not right at all. The next documented observation came from night watchman Frederick Collins, who patrolled the town between midnight and dawn. Collins reported to the newspaper that as he passed the Pettry home at approximately 2 a.m., he observed Samuel Pettry sitting alone on the front porch, as still as a statue, just staring toward the mine. Collins called out a greeting, but Samuel reportedly did not respond or acknowledge his presence in any way. Collins continued his rounds, dismissing the behavior as mere exhaustion from a long day's work. In a detail not published in the Herald but recorded in Sheriff Collins' official report, the night watchman noted that Samuel was holding something in his lap that appeared to be a mining pick, and that a shotgun was propped against the porch railing within easy reach. Collins, not wishing to startle an armed man in what appeared to be a disturbed state, chose not to approach more closely and continued his patrol. He did, however, report hearing a persistent scratching sound, like something trying to claw its way out as he passed the side of the house near the root cellar entrance. Dr. Harrington's journal entry from October 18th provides the most detailed account of what was discovered the following morning. Called to the Pettry residence at 7:15 a.m. by Sheriff Collins. Upon arrival, found Samuel Pettry still sitting on the front porch in the same position as reported by the night watchman. He was unresponsive to verbal stimuli, staring fixedly at the mine entrance. Physical examination revealed extreme dehydration and what appeared to be self-inflicted lacerations on both palms. The house itself presented a disturbing scene. Every door was indeed secured with new padlocks, the keys for which were found in Samuel's pocket. Upon entering through the front door, the interior was in a state of disarray, consistent with a struggle. The walls of the entryway and parlor had been covered with pages torn from the family Bible, specifically passages from Revelations, affixed with what appeared to be a mixture of coal dust and blood. The kitchen showed signs of recent frenzied activity. A large pot on the stove contained a boiled-down mixture of what I believe to be laudanum and other household substances, creating a potent sedative. Most concerning was the discovery of extensive scratch marks on the inside of the root cellar door, which had been reinforced with wooden planks nailed across its frame. Martha Pettry was located in the master bedroom, unconscious but alive, though in a state of severe distress and dehydration. Her condition suggested she had been heavily sedated. There were ligature marks on her wrists and ankles, indicating recent restraint. Despite a thorough search of the premises, Edward Pettry was nowhere to be found. The most troubling discovery was Edward's bedroom, which contained no personal belongings, as if he had never occupied the space. The walls had been recently whitewashed, and the floorboards showed evidence of vigorous scrubbing with lye. The attic space above Edward's room contained a disturbing arrangement of personal items, Edward's mining boots filled with soil, his pocket watch disassembled with its pieces arranged in a circular pattern, and a journal written in what Samuel later identified as Edward's handwriting, though the text consists of indecipherable symbols and drawings rather than English words. Samuel, when finally responsive to questioning, would say only that Edward has gone back to where he came from, and that the doors had to stay closed to keep us all safe. When pressed about the whereabouts of his brother, Samuel became agitated and began repeating, "Edward is in the walls now. Edward is in the walls." A subsequent search of the house, including examination of the walls, revealed nothing to substantiate this claim. In a supplementary note added later the same day, Dr. Harrington recorded, "Upon closer examination, Edward's journal contains not only the strange symbolic language, but also numerous detailed anatomical drawings of what appear to be human internal organs rendered with a precision that would be impossible for someone without medical training. Interspersed with these drawings are sketches of something that resembles a human form, but with proportions that seem deliberately wrong, limbs too long, joints bending in impossible directions, and facial features suggested rather than clearly delineated. The most disturbing pages contained what appear to be methodical observations of Martha and Samuel, documenting their sleep patterns, eating habits, and physical characteristics with the clinical detachment of a naturalist studying unfamiliar specimens. The final dated entry from October 16th contains only a single English phrase among the symbols. The host is becoming inadequate. The immediate aftermath of the discovery at the Pettry home was documented in both Dr. Harrington's journal and the Shadow Creek Herald's October 20th edition. Martha Pettry was transported to the Greenbrier Asylum in Lewisburg, where she remained uncommunicative. Samuel was taken into custody by Sheriff Collins on suspicion of involvement in his brother's disappearance. The Herald reported that a search party of local miners was organized to search the surrounding forest for any sign of Edward, but no trace was ever found. According to an interview with Sheriff Collins published on October 25th, Samuel maintained during questioning that his actions had been necessary because Edward had changed and something was using his skin. Samuel reportedly insisted that his brother had begun behaving strangely after his mining accident, becoming increasingly nocturnal and speaking in a voice that wasn't his own. A more detailed account of Samuel's statements during questioning was preserved in Sheriff Collins' personal notes, which were discovered among his effects after his death in 1919 and subsequently donated to the County Historical Society. These notes reveal that Samuel's explanation for the events was far more elaborate and disturbing than what was reported in the newspaper. Samuel Pettry continues to maintain that his brother underwent some form of transformation following the accident in April. He describes a gradual change, beginning with Edward's sleeping habits, claiming his brother would remain completely motionless during the day, often not even appearing to breathe, but would become unusually active after sundown. Pettry states that by late August, Edward had begun collecting various materials, soil from specific locations around town, insects, plant matter, and most disturbingly, small amounts of blood from both Samuel and Martha, allegedly taken while they slept. These materials were supposedly combined in glass jars kept in the root cellar, for purposes Edward would not disclose. Most concerning are Pettry's claims regarding the events of October 16, 17. He states that upon returning from work on the evening of the 16th, he found Martha in a state of extreme distress, having barricaded herself in their bedroom. According to Samuel, Martha claimed to have witnessed Edward shedding his skin in the root cellar, describing it as peeling away in long strips to reveal something dark and glistening underneath. Samuel admits to confronting his brother, at which point Edward allegedly spoke to him in a voice that echoed as if coming from the bottom of the mine shaft. The exact words are recorded in Samuel's statement. "We have existed in the deep places since before your kind crawled from the sea. Your brother gave us passage to the surface through his broken form. but it has grown insufficient. We require better vessels. Pettry claims he subdued Edward with a blow to the head, bound him, and locked him in the root cellar. He then administered laudanum to Martha and began securing the house. When questioned about the Bible pages on the walls, Samuel stated that he believed words of power might contain whatever was using Edward's form. At times, he claims Edward escaped into the walls of the house like smoke seeping through cracks. At other times, he suggests his brother returned to the mine, where it first found him. Most disturbing is his occasional insistence that Edward is still in the root cellar, just not in a form you would recognize. It is my determination that Samuel Pettry, while clearly intelligent and previously of sound mind, has suffered a psychological break brought on by the strain of caring for both his injured brother and his increasingly unstable wife. When pressed about his brother's current whereabouts, Pettry becomes agitated and contradictory. Dr. Harrington concurs with this assessment and recommends commitment to the state asylum for proper treatment. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the case is how quickly it disappeared from public record. By November 1904, the Shadow Creek Herald had ceased all mention of the Pettry incident. Dr. Harrington's journal entries become increasingly vague, referring only to the situation at the east end of town and SP's continued delusions. A review of county records conducted in 1963 by local historian Margaret Whittaker revealed that Samuel Pettry was never formally charged with any crime. Instead, he was committed to the same asylum as his wife in early November 1904. The Pettry house remained vacant and was ultimately demolished in 1911 to make way for an expansion of the mine's administrative buildings. The case might have faded into complete obscurity were it not for two subsequent discoveries. The first came in 1947, when workers expanding the mine shaft broke through into what appeared to be a previously unknown natural cavity in the mountain. According to an internal company report later obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request in 1965, the workers discovered a collection of personal effects in this cavity, including items matching the description of Edward Pettry's possessions: a pocket watch, a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles, and a leather wallet containing a mine worker's identification card with Edward's name. The report notably lacks any mention of human remains being found, despite the cavity being sealed and inaccessible from the outside. What the official report omitted, however, was revealed in personal correspondence between the mine supervisor, Harold Blackburn, grandson of the superintendent who had been present during the 1904 incident, and a colleague at a neighboring mining operation. This letter, preserved by Blackburn's family and provided to researchers in 1967, described additional findings in the cavity that were deliberately excluded from the official documentation. The items belonging to Pettry were arranged in a manner that can only be described as deliberate, forming a perfect circle on the floor of the cavity. More unsettling was the condition of these personal effects. The leather of the wallet and the fabric of the clothing found nearby showed no signs of decay, despite having presumably been in this damp environment for over 40 years. The metal of the pocket watch was untarnished, and, strangest of all, the glass of the spectacles was completely intact, yet covered on the inside surface with a thin film of what appeared to be the same dark, fine material we sometimes find in the deepest coal seams. Most disturbing of all was the discovery on the cavity wall, what appeared to be handprints, dozens of them, pressed into the solid rock as if the stone had been soft when touched. These impressions were too large to have been made by a normal human hand, with elongated fingers that tapered to points rather than typical fingertips. I made the decision to exclude these details from the official report after two of the men who initially discovered the cavity fell ill with an unusual respiratory ailment. Both described experiencing vivid, disturbing dreams in which they found themselves wandering the tunnels, following a figure they could never quite see clearly. Jenkins recovered after a week, but Harmon's condition worsened until he began claiming that something was growing inside him. He passed away 3 weeks later, with the company doctor attributing his death to pneumonia. I ordered the cavity sealed with concrete and instructed the men never to speak of what they had seen. Some things are better left buried in the deep places. The second discovery occurred in 1962 during the previously mentioned renovation of the Shadow Creek Medical Clinic, when a sealed metal box was found hidden within a wall cavity. In addition to Dr. Harrington's journal, the box contained a letter addressed to future inhabitants of Shadow Creek, dated November 30th, 1904. The letter, written in what handwriting experts later confirmed was Dr. Harrington's, contains a series of warnings and observations that the doctor apparently felt unable to share publicly at the time. The letter reads, in part, "I am increasingly convinced that what transpired in the Pettry home cannot be explained by conventional medical understanding. In my private conversations with Samuel before his commitment, he described witnessing his brother undergo periods of absence, hours where Edward would sit motionless, not blinking, followed by periods of frenzied activity during which he would collect soil, insects, and water from various locations around town. Most disturbing were Samuel's consistent reports that in the weeks before the incident, he observed Edward shedding, his term for his brother's habit of scraping large patches of skin from his arms and legs, revealing what Samuel described as something dark and textured beneath. I initially attributed these observations to Samuel's own deteriorating mental state, but the discovery of a collection of preserved skin samples in jars hidden beneath the floorboards of Edward's room gives me pause. I have sealed these samples within this box, along with my journal and this letter, as I can find no scientific explanation for their properties. The skin, if indeed it is human skin, has remained unchanged since its discovery. It does not decompose, it does not dry out, and most alarmingly, under certain lighting conditions, it appears to exhibit subtle movements even when completely undisturbed. I fear there is something in the deeper passages of the mine, something the original surveyors disturbed, that may explain both Edward's transformation following his accident and the subsequent events at the Pettry home. I have requested a transfer to a medical practice in Richmond and will be leaving Shadow Creek within the week. I implore any future reader of this letter to leave the sealed samples undisturbed and to exercise extreme caution should unusual behavioral changes be observed among those who work in the deeper sections of the mine. The letter continues with details not initially released to the public but later documented in a 1965 academic paper on Appalachian folklore by Dr. Rebecca Mitchell of West Virginia University. I must confess that my examination of Martha Pettry revealed anomalies that I deliberately omitted from my official reports. The marks on her wrists and ankles, which I initially attributed to restraints, had an unusual character. The skin around these marks showed evidence of a progressive hardening, almost a calcification, extending outward from the points of contact. More concerning was her blood work, which revealed a previously unidentified particulate matter suspended in the plasma, dark crystalline structures visible under microscopic examination. When I informed Samuel of these findings, his response was not surprise but grim confirmation. "It's trying to change her, too," he said. "That's why I had to keep her sedated. It happens slower without direct contact, but once it begins, there's no stopping it. The only mercy is that she doesn't remember what she sees when she sleeps." When I asked what he meant by this cryptic statement, Samuel described Martha's increasingly disturbing nocturnal behavior in the weeks before October 17th. According to Samuel, Martha had begun sleepwalking in September, invariably making her way to Edward's room or the root cellar. On several occasions, Samuel claimed to have found her engaged in one-sided conversations, speaking to Edward in what he described as a language that shouldn't come from a human throat. Most alarming was his assertion that on the night of October 16th, he witnessed Martha willingly extending her arm to Edward, who was allegedly in the process of making an incision in her flesh with a mining tool when Samuel interrupted them. I cannot reconcile these accounts with any known medical condition or psychological disorder. If even a fraction of Samuel's testimony is accurate, then whatever affected the Pettry household may still be present in this community, particularly in the eastern section of the mine where Edward was trapped. I leave this record in the hope that it might prevent similar occurrences, though I fear what was set in motion that April day cannot be easily contained. Upon discovery of this letter in 1962, local physician Dr. Robert Campbell reportedly opened the sealed containers mentioned by Dr. Harrington, only to find them empty. The skin samples, if they ever existed, were gone. Dr. Campbell's notes on the discovery, filed with the Town Historical Society, indicate that the empty jars contained only a fine, dark residue that dispersed when the containers were opened, like soot or extremely fine coal dust. Dr. Campbell himself became a footnote to the Pettry case when, approximately 3 weeks after examining the containers, he abruptly resigned his position at the Shadow Creek Clinic and left town without explanation. His resignation letter, preserved in county employment records, consists of a single sentence: "I can no longer in good conscience practice medicine in this community." Attempts to contact Campbell at his new address in Cincinnati were unsuccessful, and his family reported in 1964 that he had suffered a nervous collapse and was unable to discuss his time in Shadow Creek. The final documented reference to the Pettry case comes from the records of the Greenbrier Asylum. Martha Pettry remained institutionalized until her death in 1907, never having spoken another word after being found in her home. According to her medical file, obtained by researchers in 1966, Martha's condition was characterized by catatonic periods interspersed with episodes of extreme agitation during which patient attempts to remove her own skin using any available implement. The file notes that such episodes occurred exclusively between sunset and sunrise, regardless of whether Martha had visual access to a window or clock to determine the time. Samuel's fate is somewhat more ambiguous. Asylum records indicate he was transferred to the state facility in Weston in 1906, but no admission record appears in the Weston archives. His death certificate, filed in 1911, lists his place of death as unknown and the cause as presumed deceased, a highly unusual administrative designation that suggests his actual fate remained unverified. A single reference to Samuel appears in the minutes of a Blue Ridge Coal Company board meeting from September 1908. During a discussion about establishing a perimeter fence around the eastern section of the mine property, one board member reportedly asked if this was related to the Pettry incident. The board chairman's response, as recorded by the secretary, was, "The situation with former employee S. Pettry has been resolved. He will not be returning to Shadow Creek." No further context or explanation is provided in the minutes. The Blue Ridge Coal Company continued operations in Shadow Creek until 1952, when declining coal prices forced its closure. The town itself gradually diminished, and by the last census in 1960, only 28 residents remained. Today, Shadow Creek exists only as an unincorporated area, the buildings long since reclaimed by the forest. What truly happened to Edward Pettry remains one of West Virginia's most persistent mysteries. The official investigation at the time concluded that Edward had likely wandered into the forest in a confused state, resulting from complications of his mining injury, and died of exposure, a conclusion that conveniently absolved both the mining company and local law enforcement of any responsibility to pursue the matter further. However, local folklore suggests alternative explanations. One persistent rumor, documented by folklorist Ruth Ann Musick in her 1965 collection The Telltale Lilac Bush and Other West Virginia Ghost Tales, holds that miners continued to report sightings of a figure resembling Edward Pettry deep in the abandoned tunnels of the Blue Ridge mine well into the 1950s. These sightings typically described a man with a mining lamp who would appear briefly at tunnel intersections before seemingly melting into the rock walls. In her research notes, Music recorded an interview with retired miner Thomas Jenkins, who worked in the Shadow Creek mine from 1932 to 1949. Jenkins described an unwritten rule among the miners. You never worked alone in the east tunnels, and you never acknowledged if you saw someone who wasn't supposed to be there. The old-timers told us when we were new that if we ever saw a solitary figure with a lamp that cast no light on the walls around it, we were to turn and walk away without speaking or looking back. They said it wasn't really Pettry we were seeing, but something else wearing his shape like an old coat. Jenkins also described a tradition among miners of leaving small offerings, usually tobacco or whiskey, at the entrance to the eastern tunnels. It wasn't superstition exactly, he explained to Music. It was more like insurance, a way of saying, we respect the boundary. After the collapse of 38 took those 5 men, the superintendent tried to stop the practice, said it was pagan nonsense. 3 days later, he went into the east tunnel to prove there was nothing to fear. They found him the next morning, sitting against the wall with his eyes open, still alive, but not right anymore. Kept talking about the breathing darkness until they took him away to Charleston. The offerings continued after that, and management looked the other way. Perhaps more troubling is the account given by James Pettry, a distant cousin of the family, who worked as a surveyor for the mining company in its final years. In an interview conducted in 1968 for the West Virginia State Archives Oral History Project, James recalled, "The older miners wouldn't go into the East Tunnel after what happened to the Pettrys. They said that section of the mountain was wrong, that the coal there burned differently, gave off fumes that caused men to have strange dreams. Some even claimed they could hear voices in that section, voices that sounded like they were coming from inside the rock itself." The company sealed that tunnel in 1926 after 3 miners disappeared there in the span of a month. When asked about his relatives, James became notably reticent, saying only, "In my family, we don't speak about what happened to Samuel, Martha, and Edward. But I'll tell you this much. My grandfather, who was Samuel's cousin, moved his family clear to Kentucky after it happened. He wouldn't even pass through Shadow Creek on his way to visit relatives. Said he'd seen Samuel the day before it all happened, and Samuel had told him, 'I think Edward brought something back with him from the deep part of the mine, something that's growing inside him.' Grandfather never set foot in a mine again after that." In the decades since the incident, the story of the Pettry family has occasionally resurfaced in paranormal literature, often embellished with supernatural elements absent from the historical record. What remains factually verifiable is this. 3 people lived in a house in Shadow Creek in the autumn of 1904. By the end of October that year, 1 had vanished without a trace, and the other 2 were institutionalized, never to return to their home. And for one October night, every door in that house was locked from the outside, allegedly to keep something in rather than to keep others out. The land where the Pettry house once stood remained vacant after the mining company buildings were themselves abandoned in the 1950s. In 1967, a geological survey team from West Virginia University conducted soil samples throughout the area as part of a study on the environmental impact of abandoned coal mines. Their report, published in a 1968 academic journal, noted an unusual finding. The soil at the former Pettry home site contained significantly higher concentrations of unidentified organic compounds than surrounding areas, creating what the researchers described as a distinct chemical signature unlike anything else in the region. The team's lead geologist, Dr. Victor Shelton, included a footnote in the published study that has fueled speculation among those interested in the case. Soil samples from Site E7, corresponding to the former residential structure on the eastern edge of the survey area, exhibited properties that warrant further investigation. Under laboratory conditions, the organic material extracted from these samples demonstrated unexpected behavior, including phosphorescence when exposed to ultraviolet light and unusual patterns of cellular organization under microscopic examination. Most notable was the soil's apparent resistance to supporting common vegetation, a phenomenon visible at the site itself, where the foundation outline remains conspicuously barren 63 years after the structure's demolition. What Dr. Shelton's official publication omitted, but what was later revealed in his personal research notes acquired by West Virginia University's Special Collections in 1972, was that the organic material found at the Pettry site contained carbon compounds with molecular structures inconsistent with any known form of life indigenous to the region. Most concerning was his observation that when samples were maintained in dark, damp conditions similar to those found in the mine, they exhibited measurable growth over time, despite lacking any apparent means of sustaining themselves. Dr. Shelton proposed a follow-up study, but university records indicate his funding request was denied. He subsequently left his position at WVU, and his professional publications after 1968 focus exclusively on conventional geological formations in other regions, with no further mention of Shadow Creek or his unusual findings there. A colleague of Shelton's, who requested anonymity when interviewed in 1974, suggested that the university's rejection of the follow-up study was influenced by pressure from state officials concerned about potential economic impact on the region's mining industry. Victor had found something that defied conventional scientific understanding, the colleague stated, something that suggested the possibility of an unknown organic process occurring deep within the abandoned mine system. The implications were too disturbing and potentially too damaging to the state's primary industry to allow further investigation. The final documented connection to the Pettry case emerged in 1969, when construction workers breaking ground for a new highway near the former site of Shadow Creek discovered what appeared to be a human-made tunnel not connected to the known mine workings. According to the incident report filed by the construction company, the tunnel extended horizontally into the mountainside for approximately 15 feet before terminating in a small chamber. Inside this chamber, workers found a collection of glass jars arranged in a circular pattern around a central wooden chair. The jars reportedly contained various preserved specimens, insects, plant matter, soil samples, and what appeared to be organic material of uncertain origin. More unusual was the discovery of hundreds of pages of notes written in a cramped, meticulous hand tacked to the chamber walls. The writing reportedly combined conventional English with the same symbolic language found in Edward Pettry's journal, discovered in the attic of the family home. According to the construction foreman's statement, before experts could be called to examine the site, an unexplained collapse sealed the tunnel, burying the chamber and its contents. The highway project was subsequently rerouted, and the area was designated unstable for construction. The incident report, along with photographs taken by the workers before the collapse, was filed with the State Transportation Department, but was later reported missing during an archive reorganization in 1975. One photograph, however, survived as it had been kept by the foreman himself. Donated to the State Historical Society after his death in 1982, the black and white image shows the interior of the chamber, though the quality is too poor to make out details of the writing on the walls. What is clearly visible, however, is the arrangement of jars, and sitting prominently on the wooden chair, a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles identical to those described in Edward Pettry's mine worker identification card. What the photograph cannot convey, but what was described in detail in the foreman's personal journal, also donated to the Historical Society, was the condition of the chamber itself. According to the foreman, Robert Caldwell, the walls of the chamber appeared to have been melted and reformed rather than carved, with a smooth, almost glassy texture unlike the surrounding rock. Most disturbing was his description of what happened when the workers attempted to remove one of the jars for closer examination. The glass seemed to be fused with the wooden shelf it sat upon, as if the two materials had somehow melted together. When Johnson tried to force it free, the jar shattered, releasing not just the preserved insect specimens inside, but also a fine dark powder that immediately dispersed into the air. Johnson inhaled some before he could step back and began coughing violently. We helped him outside, where he seemed to recover quickly, but he complained of a metallic taste in his mouth and a strange sensation that he described as movement under my skin. He insisted on going home early, saying he felt unwell. It was Johnson who first reported hearing noises behind the chamber walls that night, and Johnson who returned to the site alone the next morning before the scheduled shift. We found him inside the chamber, sitting in the wooden chair, staring at the wall, unresponsive to questions or commands. By the time the medical team arrived, the tunnel had collapsed, sealing everything inside. Johnson was the only one we couldn't account for afterward. Caldwell's journal goes on to note that in the weeks following the collapse, 5 of the 8 workers who had entered the chamber reported experiencing vivid, disturbing dreams, in which they found themselves back in the tunnel, following a figure deeper into the mountain. 2 of these men subsequently relocated from the area without notice, while a third was admitted to a psychiatric facility in Charleston after what his family described as a complete personality change. Caldwell himself reported no unusual effects, which he attributed to the fact that he had never actually touched any of the objects in the chamber. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Pettry case is not what is known, but what remains fundamentally unexplained. The transformation of a seemingly ordinary mining family, the unidentified organic materials that continue to prevent growth at the home site, and most significantly, the fate of Edward Pettry, a man who, according to his brother's disturbed testimony, was in the walls of a house that no longer exists. As we conclude our examination of this disturbing chapter in Shadow Creek's history, one question lingers. Was Samuel Pettry's desperate act of sealing his home an expression of mental illness, or was he, as his cousin later suggested, attempting to contain something that defied conventional understanding? The final entry in Dr. Harrington's journal, dated the day before his departure from Shadow Creek, offers no definitive answers, but leaves us with a troubling observation. In my final visit to the Pettry home site today, I noticed something that continues to disturb my scientific understanding. The padlocks Samuel placed on the doors, all of which were facing outward, designed to keep something in rather than out, show peculiar damage. The metal is deformed not from external force, but appears to have been altered from within, as if something inside the house exerted pressure against these barriers. I leave Shadow Creek tomorrow with the sincere hope that whatever was contained within those walls remains there, deep in the foundation soil, never to emerge again. The abandoned mining town of Shadow Creek was finally removed from West Virginia maps in 1972, the site reclaimed by the forest that surrounds it. Yet even today, local residents of neighboring communities share a common piece of folk wisdom. Avoid the eastern slopes of that particular mountain after sundown, for the ground there, they say, sometimes moves in ways that ground should not move, as if something just beneath the surface is still trying to find its way out. A final postscript to this story emerged in 1968, when an elderly resident of a nursing home in Richmond, Virginia, claiming to be Dr. Thomas Harrington himself, granted a brief interview to a graduate student researching Appalachian mining communities. The man, whose identity could not be conclusively verified but whose handwriting bore striking similarities to the journal discovered in Shadow Creek, offered what he claimed was the true explanation for his hasty departure from the town in 1904. "I didn't leave because I was afraid of what might be in the mine," the man told the student. "I left because of what I saw in Martha Pettry's blood under my microscope the night before I packed my belongings. The dark particulate matter was moving, not floating or shifting as particles in solution might, but moving with purpose, organizing itself into structures before my eyes. When I looked away for a moment and then returned to the eyepiece, the structures had changed, becoming more complex. It was as if the material was aware it was being observed and was demonstrating its capabilities. I destroyed the slide, packed only what I could carry, and left town that night without informing anyone of my departure. I have spent the subsequent decades convincing myself that what I witnessed was a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the strain of the Pettry case. But part of me has always known the truth, that whatever entered Edward Pettry in the depths of that mine was still spreading, still seeking new vessels. And I couldn't bear to consider what might happen if it found its way out of Shadow Creek. Whether this account represents the genuine recollections of Dr. Harrington or the confused memories of an elderly man is impossible to determine. What remains undeniable is that something unusual occurred in the small mining community of Shadow Creek in the autumn of 1904, something that resulted in one man's disappearance, the institutionalization of two others, and the beginning of a slow decline that would eventually erase the town itself from the map. To this day, the eastern slopes of the mountain remain undeveloped, avoided by locals and untouched by the resource extraction that has transformed so much of the surrounding landscape. The story of the Pettry family and the day every door stayed closed serves as a somber reminder that some mysteries are perhaps better left unsolved, some doors better left locked, and some depths better left unplumbed.